and welcome to the podcast Transformations. My name is Nick Bank, and on this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Mr. Olaf. Hello, Olaf.
Hey, Nick. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Olaf, where are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in from Duisburg in Germany.
Good. Well, Olaf, great to have you on the podcast. This has been a long time coming. We wanted to make agendas come together, and here we are in the middle of at least European summer vacation. And I've really been looking forward to getting you on the podcast. You and I, we share a common interest within the field of lean, transformation, and change management. But for those that don't know you, would you mind just telling the listeners just a bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to do this. And first of all, Nick, thanks for having me on this podcast. It's great initiative. So happy to be contributing. So I currently work for a company called Danaher, multinational company based in the US. And I'm responsible for the Danaher business system, which is our way of continuous improvement in the biotechnology group, which is one of the platforms Danaher has. And the Cytiva brand acquired from GE Biopharma in 2020, about 3 years ago, might be a brand which rings a bell with some people. So that's me professionally. Otherwise, as I said, German, live in Germany, 52 years old, married, no kids, no dogs, no cats. And when I'm not working, which is not much, I like biking. I like to do a bit of traveling. Actually, Scandinavian, the Nordic countries. Just come back from Sweden and Finland, doing a bit of cruising between Turku and Stockholm. Beautiful part of the country, especially at this time of the year.
Yes, thank you. Great to hear, and certainly those areas are just beautiful, and it's a perfect time to be traveling there in the early summer and midsummer. So Olaf, thank you for your introduction. And during our preparatory call, I asked you to consider a transformative experience that we could talk about on the podcast. But before we do that, would you mind sharing your own definition of transformation?
Yeah, happy to do that. For me, as a continuous improvement professional, if you like, transformation is a continuous improvement event. The old process doesn't really work anymore because it's not good enough, because it's not set up well, because it's not executed well. So now what? Right? We need to be doing things differently, revised process, a new process completely from scratch. So that for me is a transformation, right? Changing an old process into a new process from a very general point of view.
And is that a very conscious and rational decision, or is that something that grows over time? How do you get to the transformative point, so to say?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me personally, it's often this oh shoot moment, right? Where you realize that you're up against something which is different. You're trying to do your usual stuff, your usual playbook, your usual problem-solving approach, and then you realize, meh, it's not going to work. So that for me is usually the red flagging of, oh, there's a transformation coming, right? Usually not using that word, but for me it's often this conscious moment of, oh, the old playbook's not going to work. And then obviously that evolves over time. And for the one I'll refer to, it looks a lot clearer now, almost 20 years later, than it was back in those days. But it's always easier to talk from a history point of view.
Yes. Yeah. We talk about, that we have that sort of 2020 vision in hindsight, right? It's so easy to see. And at the same time, sometimes we talk about, had we only known. But at the same time, taking that approach sometimes means that we would have missed other things. There are things that we wouldn't have learned, or things that we wouldn't have tried out to find out that they didn't work before we went to that point.
Indeed.
So it's interesting to hear that you have sort of, when you say a continuous improvement event, it's almost contradictory in terms, right? Yeah. So yeah. Can you talk more? Can you talk more about that?
I like your question, Nick, about whether it's a conscious event or not, because there's probably some conscious part to it, some rational thinking, and then there's a lot of context around it where you realize now, 20 years later, oh my God, that was so clear now versus back in those days. And what I'd like to take or to do is to take us all back into August 2004. So getting my numbers right here. So I'd just been promoted to the Tide and Bonox brand manager for Procter & Gamble in Central Europe South, or CES. And that was quite a bit of change for me personally. Number one, I just relocated to Budapest, so I was in temporary housing. I was commuting every weekend with my then girlfriend, now wife. I was responsible for 2 brands. Back in those days, we had 3 detergent brands. We had Ariel as the top tier, the most important and most expensive brand. And then we had Tide as number 2 and Bonox as number 3. So I had this number 2 and number 3 brands. And that was the second biggest brand manager position in Central Europe South. And when I started to look into what that position actually was, it turned out that it was 5 countries: Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Croatia. Had I ever been to any of those countries? No. Do I know the languages? No. Did I know the capitals of those countries? No. So here I was, 2 brands, 5 countries, 5 languages, 4 countries in the European Union, 1 not. And what we should also know as part of the context was that I had been in P&G for 6 years, but most of that time, actually 4 years and a bit, was in information technology. And then I got sick and tired of being the internal consultant who always said to the marketing people, hey, you should do A. And they said, hey, wonderful advice, Olaf. We really appreciate your thoughts. We're going to do B. So I got sick and tired of being the internal consultant. I changed into marketing. And at that moment, when I went to Budapest, I had, 1.5 years of experience in management. So, or in marketing rather than management. So I wasn't the most experienced marketing person. Actually, when I came to Budapest, one of the people in my team had been to the same assistant brand manager college with me, the kind of foundational event. So obviously people were asking questions like, who's he? What's he doing here? How can he help us? And guess what? I asked myself exactly the same questions, right? What the hell am I doing here? And how can I possibly add value? And that for me was a transformation event because, as I said earlier, I realized that moment that the normal playbook didn't work, right? In the good old German management tradition, you need to be the most knowledgeable person in the room. You need to tell people exactly what to do, micromanage everybody every time. Clearly, those 2 wouldn't work because I wasn't the most knowledgeable person in the room. I couldn't even sign off an invoice because Hungarian is a pretty tough language and you don't get any idea of what was on the invoice. And back in those days in P&G, there wasn't really a playbook of how to do brand manager assignments. So there was a lot of heroism, right? People came in and they had a very tough situation and then they became the hero and they solved everything and they lived on happily ever after. So, what now? And what I'd like to share in the next 10, 15 minutes or so is how I approach that situation. Maybe, Nick, for some of the listeners, that might be helpful, just going through my kind of thought process. I actually put that into a kind of a paper. P&G was very big on writing back in those days. My boss actually asked me to summarize that for a team event before I left Budapest in 2006. So I have a pretty good written down story of what I did, even from that perspective, not just from now, almost 20 years later. So what did I do? I remembered that in university, I had a number of very good professors who encouraged me to do critical thinking and problem solving, right? To be very open, not just follow the path or the textbook, but really think. And what I also remembered were those two things which were pretty high on the P&G agenda, that whatever you do as a leader, as a manager, you focus on building the business and building the organization, right? So those were my kind of guiding posts, and that those two I would also like to use here a bit. The first one, building the business, was really focusing on the customers, or the consumers, as we like to call them in P&G. And our CEO back in those days, A.G. Leffley, was a master of simplification. A.G. always told us, look, the consumer's boss, so you need to understand the world through her eyes. And then he said there are two moments of truth. When she goes shopping in the store, and she either picks our brand or the others, and then at the moment of use at home, when she uses our brand and she's either delighted or not. And those were extremely good guiding posts of getting started. So we did a lot of shopping together with consumers. We did a lot of in-home visits to see how they live and how they use detergents. And now you might say, well, yeah, detergents, everybody uses detergents. That's easy, that's simple, that's common sense. Well, yes and no. The Bonox brand, which was our trouble kit back in those days, was the low tier brand. So low income people. And I can tell you, I remember one of those visits, literally 5 minutes walking from the office in Budapest, where we came into a tiny 1-bedroom flat with a couple, 2 kids. I remember we stepped into the room. It was the living room and the kitchen as one. And I remember on the left, we had the cooker, and next to the cooker was the shower, right next to the cooker. So tiny flat. And when you see the consumer's world through those eyes, you learn a lot, right? You learn that the box of detergent is the most expensive item in their shopping trolley. Think about it, right? You learn that they're extremely risk averse because the kids only have one pair of trousers. So they need to be washed at night. And if the trousers don't turn out clean, the kid will go to school with dirty clothes, which is the worst you can have as a mother, right? So another insight. People were extremely risk averse in switching detergent brands because they said, well, I know this one works. It's kind of good enough. I know it's not the best, but for what I can afford, it's a good one. I'm not switching. People were extremely skeptical about any advertising. And they always felt a bit screwed as Eastern Europeans because they had this conviction that the Western European detergents were much better and they got the weaker formula. Actually, they didn't, but that's another story for another day. So really going close to the consumer, doing a bit of an anthropological study, if you like, and that helped me a lot because when you have this direct consumer involvement, you can add value. Because often you see things as a foreigner, which the local teams did not see. And by the way, it was just fascinating to get to know those countries in that way. As a tourist, you never get, or you hardly ever get into homes of Hungarians or Czech, Slovakian people, Slovenian people, Croatian people. And you certainly don't get to that level of the society, if you want to call it like that, right? If you go in with business colleagues, you don't get a tiny 1-bedroom flat. You might get the upper end of what's possible. So just a fascinating experience. So that was the first one, right? Focus on the customer to build the business. And then secondly, and that's why I hope there might be a few takeaways for our listeners here, it's building the business, building the organization, building the people. And I realized pretty quickly that there were some mindset challenges with the team, right? The two brands had been performing not so well, certainly below expectations, not really growing. And then back in those days, what you need to know, Nick, is that the Hungarian society is an extremely pessimistic society. So I always thought Germans were pessimistic, but boy, I learned in Hungary. So one of my colleagues said, the Hungarian history is a chain of glorious defeats. So just one example of being a very fatalistic sort of outlook, and obviously that spilled into the business as well. So we did a lot of work on making sure that we have ownership. We can kind of work on our own fate. It's not all given by external factors. One of the books we used was Captain Mike Abrashoff's work, It's Your Ship, that, hey, you determine where your future is going. You have the opportunity to change things. You can be in a driver's seat versus being the victim, right? You can change things, own the business, make your own decision. Passion for the job, right? There's this story about the 3 bricklayers, right? And you ask the first one, what are you doing? Well, I'm earning my money. You ask the second one, well, I want to be the best bricklayer in the company or in the country. And then you ask the third one, what are you doing? I'm building a cathedral. Right? Contribution to the whole. So I encourage people to have their own attitude or check their own attitude, because that's something you can change. And back in those days, I checked on the website whether it's still current, and it is. We use the Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle, where they literally throw fish across the market. They still do this 20 years later, so it's still a current example. Nobody's telling them to have that attitude. That's a team decision. That's an individual decision. And I just encourage people to, or my team and several others in the organization, to think about your own passion, because if you're not passionate as a leader, or if you're not passionate as a brand representative, how could consumers get passionate about what you have on offer, what you sell, right? And I also helped them understand. We obviously worked a lot with senior management in Detergents Europe, that senior management obviously has a much more positive view on people who are passionate and like to change things rather than the others. So the credibility you get if you're forward-looking, if you're active, that pays a lot in the credibility you have, right? So it's your ship. Second one, somewhat related, is this quote from Dale Carnegie: when fate hands you lemons, make lemonade, right? Be optimistic, because again, you have a choice of how to react to external events. You can say, oh my God, it's bad and we can't do anything, and then commiserate all day. Or you can say, there's an opportunity here. Or of course, we had a big formidable competitor in Hungary with Henkel, was the other big international player in detergents. But hey, that's been the same for 20 years and will probably stay the same for the next 5 years, but you can still do things about it. And as Mark Sanborn used to say back in those days, nobody can prevent you from being exceptional other than yourself. So again, an offer for my team to look at the mindset and choose optimism versus pessimism, right? And related to that is the choice of action versus complaining. If you have 1 hour, the choice is yours. You can spend the 1 hour complaining and not doing anything, or you can spend 5 minutes complaining and then do the rest of the time on action. Who's going to do what by when to improve? And we and the team chose the latter. And we had this little cartoon, which I found somewhere, didn't really have an attribution to it, that it wasn't the warning about the rain which saved Noah, it was building the ark. So let's build the ark, and let's not complain about the rain, because complaining about the rain doesn't get you anywhere, right? It doesn't help. And we worked with a number of wonderful examples from the music world about possibility. Ben Zander, who's a conductor in Boston, he's written this wonderful book on the art of possibility. And if any of you ever wants to have a look at YouTube and search for Ben or Benjamin Zander, wonderful stuff, wonderful lectures on music history and motivation, optimism, and possibility at the same time. Wonderful speaker. And we use that again to make sure we stay in the action mindset, in the optimism mindset, to get things going and help us improve. And then the last one we talked about in focusing on the team and building the organization was this idea of focus. And that has become more relevant in the last 20 years and will probably become even more relevant in the next 20 years, that, hey, there's a million things we can do any day. And the more we can focus on those 20% of potential actions, which gives us 80% of the results, the better. And Pareto principle is alive, right? So I like to focus on the top 2 or top 3 things, because I know that if we get those done, we get probably the majority of the results versus trying to do 25 things and not get done anything at all because people are just overloaded, right? So that's a question I've taken away for every follow-up assignment after that. What are the top 3 things that only I can do in this situation? So like a bit of bottleneck thinking or adding value thinking. What's the specific value I can add with my background, with my story, where I come from? And that's also closely related to the 7 coaching questions Michael Bungay-Stanier likes to ask. One of them is, if you're saying yes to this option, what are you saying no to? Because if you keep adding things without subtracting others, you'll be all over the place, right? And we're not Herbert von Karajan, the big conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. There's this little story about him where he jumps into a cab and then the cab driver asks, "Sir, where would you like to go?" And he answered something like, "Well, I don't know, they need me everywhere." Right? Well, yes, we're all needed everywhere, but it's not going to get to any specific action in a certain place, right? Who's going to do what by when to improve the business? So again, those were the 2 things we focus on building the organization. It's your ship. When fates hand you lemon, make lemonade, and then focus on what matters most. You are the one who makes the choices, right? So that was my little transformation story, major transformation in my leadership style. It was a successful assignment for both the business, which grew, and the team. I actually learned that one of the assistant brand managers in my team has just been promoted to country GM position in Albania in a big telecommunication company. So apparently the assignment hasn't really destroyed his career, which is good.
Yes.
And as we'll talk about more in the next session, is that this experience certainly still helps me today in the way I lead businesses and teams.
Olaf, thank you for sharing your experience. It was very rich, very detailed, and obviously it's a story you've told before. I have many questions and comments. I will save them for next week. I look forward to talking to you again. So now is the time on the podcast where, through the wonders of modern technology, and I don't know if P&G is working on this or maybe Cytiva, but we get to experience time travel, right? So when we come back, after me having snapped my fingers, you will have listened to yourself, sharing your experience, and we'll talk about your reflections and any relevant associations. So with that, Olaf, thank you for today and talk to you in a week.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. And hello, Olaf. Thank you for coming back on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm good, Nick. Thanks for having me again. How are you?
Good. Thank you. I have really been looking forward to the conversation today, and I'm so curious. So, what did it feel like to listen to yourself talking it to your transformative experience?
It's been weird. I'm not a big fan of listening to myself or watching myself I remember the old days. I started being a football referee when I was 14, and sometimes we had these weekend trainings and seminars. And in those days, with these huge video cameras of the 1980s, they were taping little situations for body language and stuff, and you had to watch yourself, and then you had to critique yourself. And that's when it started that I didn't really like watching myself or listening to myself. Yeah. Sometimes now you have to do it when I'm doing a few training videos for my team or for people in the organization, and obviously you need to check whether the sound works. But I try to avoid it when I can.
Well, thank you for actively leaning into this and putting yourself on the spot. This podcast, as you know, comes out in both video and sound. I like to say when I do sound that most things can be fixed in post-production. Mm-hmm. In video, however, you can't hide. You cannot, your eyes, but my eyes will start wandering, and whenever there's something where we are curious, yes, exactly, people are yawning. I had a few cases where I might have shared this, where there was a person where his eyes started wandering and his attention was sort of deflected. And I found, and he later told me that there was a fire alarm in his building. Ooh. So you never know. I've had cats walking by. I've had plants falling down. We'll just take it, play it by ear and see how it goes, right? Like any normal conversation. Indeed. And actually, yeah. I really enjoy the conversations where we just, imagine that we're sitting in a cafe somewhere, and you can't go back and say, oh, I didn't mean that. So I just, let's just try to see how the conversation goes. So since you suffered through watching yourself, what are your reflections from your experience?
I had a number of reflections. Number one, I was reminded how timely the discussion was. Some of the elements I lived back in those days with the team in Budapest are today's situation again, right? Are you a victim, or are you playing proactively? So that was the first thing that came to my mind. Well, it's on the one hand, it's 20 years old, but on the other hand, it's still relevant to a large extent. So that was surprising. Maybe I should relive some other events in the past to see how current they are. That was the first thing. The second I realized, or I noticed, was that I was pretty calm, and in a way that's also the situation back in those days. But then again, there was obviously a lot of pressure, as you picked up on, and there was a bit of risk. And again, I attribute that a bit back to the refereeing days, where you also want to, even under high pressure situations, you want to appear calm. And in those days, I sometimes got the feedback, hey, you appear to be very calm and it doesn't stress you at all. Well, that's what it appears like. But we sometimes joke it's like management by duck, right? Above the water is very calm and composed. Below the water, it's paddling like hell to get where you want to get to. So those were initial impressions I had.
I think it's interesting for me to hear you share I like to call it, stay calm and paddle like hell, like the duck example that you talk about. And certainly the way that you told the story in terms of your curiosity, being very humble about, what is the job to be done, what are the tools available, being very rational about, you very quickly established that there's a number of things that you cannot do, like you cannot understand Czech. And the Finnish-Ugrian language stem is a challenge unto itself, as we know. So yeah. You're probably not going to learn that in your tenure in that part of the organization. But then I think what happens is that you very quickly establish a way forward. You find out, okay, here is something that we need to do. Here is something where we can learn more. Here is a way where we can experience more. You talk about the value of the organization and the customer. And I think in that sense, and I'm trying to please your maybe your German, but at least the rational side of things. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about where that would be coming from, because you brought up the example of back to your refereeing days. Is there something in your past where this sort of this very sort of solution-oriented approach, where that is coming from? Do you have any reflections on that?
It's a good question, Nick. I'm the son of a German engineer by the textbook, so that's certainly my father's had still or has a large influence on that, I think, because he always, when I ran into problems, he always challenged me to look at solutions, to be curious, and to run little experiments. I remember we used to go to Norway a lot, and they had a little lake, and in those days, I don't know whether Fischer technique is something you had in Denmark as well, the little things which moved and stuff, and we were building this little boat which had 2 empty milk cans as sort of floating devices, and then it had a little, like a pedal steamer, all built from Fischer technique, and that was an experience of, hey, if you look at things in a constructive way, if you try out things, if you try storm, if you play around, you'll get there. And I think that had a very strong influence on me, of just moving forward and taking action. And then my my wife would say, I'm a no drama person, right? I don't like to dwell in complaining and the world is bad and all the rest of it. I get very nervous because it gives me this feeling of I'm not moving. And moving is something which I guess is important for me. And that sort of led me to, and I guess that's why I'm in the lean world today in continuous improvement, led me into these scientific experiments. Hey, you and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but let's do the experiment, and it'll go this way or it'll go that way. And then some people say, well, you either succeed or fail. I would rather say you either succeed or you learn, because even if it fails, it gives you some indication of moving forward. And that's sort of how I think about it, right? No drama. If you act in a rational way, you'll get some sort of learning, and off you go.
Thank you for sharing your personal story about your father. I really appreciate you making some of the connections between how you were brought up and how you act today. And I was considering the element of how you described transformation last time as an event, something that's, again, we are in rational land here. And I was wondering, with the work that you do today, working with change and transformation in an international setting, we talked about this just before. We have a few common references from your professional experience. Do you see any marketable or any, so we say, how would I say this? Do you see any remarkable differences between national cultures when you try to work with transformations?
Yes, and no. So if I look at my story, and if I look at my reflections about it, Nick, I always have 2 levels. I have the sort of the me level and the systemic level, right? What happened to me, and my reaction to the systemic level is much stronger than the me level. So what does that mean? That means like that I realized back in those days in Budapest that I want to make sure that when I leave and somebody takes my job, they are better prepared for it than I was. So that's the systemic level. What can you leverage in the system? And why I'm telling you this? I'm telling you this because when you ask about national culture in the me level, of course, there's a lot of difference between personalities, between different types of people, between nations.
at the sort of systemic level of how people react to, how systems react to change, I don't really see that much difference. It's always a series of individual events or individual reactions. But if you look at the systemic level, there are a lot of commonalities which we work with, obviously in DBS, on continuous improvement, on lean, whatever you want to call it, because there's always the period where you need to gain awareness, or where people need to have awareness of, well, there's probably change needed here. You need to have some sort of desire. You need to make a conscious decision on whether you want to join or not. You need to have a certain amount of knowledge, training, and in order to understand what it is that's different. You need to apply it, and see how it works in the real world, not just talk about it, do it, and then there's some form of sustainment or reinforcement. So I found that model is pretty general for change management and also coaching. But yeah, if we take your question in a bit of a narrow way, then of course there are major differences. It seems the Danish culture and the Hungarian culture are more on the negative side. Oh my God, what could happen? Germans are also very strongly on the negative side. And then there are other cultures. Croatia was one of the markets I had back in those days, which seemed a lot more optimistic. Hey, we'll make this work. The Americans tend to be a lot more optimistic, a lot more, hey, let's do it and see how it works. So yeah, it's important, I think, to be aware of these differences and then work with these differences. Because if you talk to a Hungarian or Danish or German audience, don't be too optimistic in your change management approach, or people will just look at you and say, he's weird, isn't he?
Yeah. What does he know that we don't know?
Exactly, right?
Yeah. I wanted to return to one of the themes that we discussed in the first session, namely this element of motivation, contribution, and creating an impact. And I think one of the themes that you brought up is that it can be very satisfying to be recognized, at least even by yourself, that here we made, a personal, unique contribution. And when we talk about organizational structure, that, we have different levels, and there's actually one called individual contributor, which I sometimes see as sort of this lone wolf, but actually an individual contributor can also, if we step out of the organizational chart for a minute, can mean something that a person that uniquely applies their skills. It is only Olaf that can do this. It's only Nikolai that can do this through a combination of, historical events and trainings and persons and networking activities. Here we are, and it sort of all comes together. And I was wondering, when you talk about transformation as being an event, so we have it, again, the very rational side. How do you make sure that you have enough opinions in the room where people they can agree, they have enough psychological safety that they can disagree, and still you come out at the end of the event with something that is hopefully better than it was before? What are some of your considerations there?
Yeah. Psychological safety is very important for us in the professional sense, because we've realized that if you look at even the same continuous improvement tool set or methodology, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly in the organizational execution of that. And psychological safety is one of the drivers between the good ones and the not so good ones, right? If you go into the lean culture, red, green is very strong, right? Are we red or are we green versus the target? And if the lack of psychological safety prevents you from acknowledging that you're red, very strong in Germany, right? We need to be all green. We don't want to show any weakness. Well, then the system doesn't really work. So what I learned from a very good colleague of mine, Patrick Donahue, does the learning, a lot of the learning and coaching in Danaher. He talked a lot about vulnerability, right? Showing being vulnerable as a leader and set the atmosphere so that everybody in the room thinks, well, if he can show his weaknesses, if he can be open about what he's messed up, that's good. And we had an interesting example where one of my colleagues in the DBS office, in the Danaher business system office, was leading a remote conversation with our CEO. And then my colleague asked me, "Oh, I'm running out of questions. What should I ask him?" So I typed into the chat. I said, "Well, ask him about the biggest mistakes he's ever made and see what that does." And to the credit of Rainer Blair, our CEO, he really got fired up and he got into, I did this wrong and I did that one. And it was a wonderful way of sharing with the organization that, hey, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be open about mistakes, and it's okay to learn about mistakes. So what I do now, one of the elements I teach is launch excellence. So how to bring new innovation products to market. And how I typically start is that, look, this is a module of all the mistakes we've ever made, right? So it's a collection of mistakes and a collection of best practices to fight these mistakes. So I'm sometimes amazed that it's a bit of a communal experience at times when people come and say, I thought I was the only one making these launch mistakes, but I thought I saw everybody makes these mistakes. So let's be open. Ben Zander, the conductor from Bosnia, always says we should all shout out how fascinating when somebody makes a mistake, just to show, hey, it's normal, and create the atmosphere. And I think what you brought up, this idea of psychological safety, is very important to do that, because if we're all human and if we're all humble, it's much easier to have those conversations versus if you come in and you try to be the big hero and the only one who can do it. So that's my little collection of stories on that.
Certainly, the issue of vulnerability is a key one, and I think the way that you talk about it reminds me of that. Whether we hear about the problems or not, they are still there. So, what can we do to bring them to the surface? What can we do? Because when we know about them, and preferably we want to see the problems when they're small, because all big problems started as small problems, then at least we can do something about it. And they're much easier to do something about when they're smaller than when they're bigger, right? But in many cases, we see problems get so big and so overwhelming, and people try to solve it through a series of containment actions until, they either have such a big impact on other parts of the business such that then somebody else would realize that you have a problem, or that you have tried to solve it in so many different ways and the problem just, quote unquote, won't go away.
Indeed.
And then we get into problem solving, and it's much more difficult because now maybe we're talking about several business areas, several product lines, across many different functions, maybe across several different countries, and it is much more difficult to solve, rather than somebody would have said, here is something like you were talking about last time. This, you sort of get this feeling, and I know both the Danes and the Japanese apparently also do this, sucking the air through the teeth, right? Something is going on,
Yeah.
right? And then we know we only need to hear that sound, then we know, okay, something is going on here. And then are we in a state where we can talk about this? And a colleague of mine talked about, I've always used current state. He talks about the actual state. Maybe it's just words, but there's something about it, right? We want to know how things actually are, not just, not what we think they are or what we think that they should be, what we want to know. And I believe in Poland, they say you want to have the coffee on the table. In Danish, you want to have the fish on the table. I'm not sure what it is in German, but I think most countries have this sort of, I don't know, maybe this is the sausage, I don't know, but something on the table.
Thinking about it now.
Yeah. Do you have an expression like that? Be honest.
I don't think we have in Germany. We're not keen to look at the full problem, apparently, so we don't even have an expression for that.
No, I was visiting a business in Switzerland a few years ago, And there I noticed that through the use of, visual management, it was very easy to see what was going on. And, but what I saw was that I saw a lot of green. I didn't see a lot of sort of red working in progress towards green. It was either there or we didn't hear about it. And I think this sort of switch makes you wonder, where's your other workshop? The one where all the broken down machinery is, or where's your, the department for all your people that got stress, or, because sometimes we just see, and it's just like glossy paper, right? And you wander in and you sort of try to get like a smell of the place, and it's like you're missing something. We're only seeing maybe the front of the house, right? So what we can do, through, if we use different tools or different understandings, is to get an understanding of what's actually going on. And we know that takes skill and obviously confidence, and sometimes it's easier to have consultants. I have actually, as a consultant once, been asked, well, not asked, I was told not to share the results of our initial value stream map because they could not realize that, that it could be that bad. And I said, this is pretty normal. This is what I would expect. And they were like, no. We can't tell our managers that we're this bad. And I said, for me, it's not good or bad. It was pretty bad, but it's just the way it is. The question is, what do you want to do about it? And I think certainly this first realization, they really struggled. So sometimes, we are in a position where we, as managers, when we walk into a factory or in a business area where we get a lot of information, and we need to think about how can we best, coming back to my point, how can we best use that to create an impact to the organization, and I think that's it talks into the element of vulnerability, because people, they sometimes say, hey, come over here, I want to show you something, and then then you're getting closer, right? But the question is, how many other areas are there, and what is it that we should do first, right?
That's true. And that reminds me of a little story. When I started in P&G, I started in IT, and in those days, it was the early days of video conferencing. So here we go. We have the European P&G leadership team in a video conference. And as it was early days, you had to have an assistant and an IT person in the room just in case things go wrong. So I think it was Tony Belloni in those days. He had who led the European business for P&G. So he had a little scorecard for every country. It had certain categories, certain brands, and then it had red, green. And it was a self-scoring. So it was not necessarily on objective criteria. It was a self-scoring. And here we go back to national stereotypes. The UK scorecard was all red. Why? Rationale, the more red we show, the more help we get, right? In terms of additional resources. The German scorecard was all green. Rationale, well, this is a scorecard, and you don't want to appear weak. You have to be strong. So that's indeed when I started learning, and it shows what you mentioned, right? Some companies don't like to be seen as red because that's just not the culture. There are cultures where you're green, and as a leader, you're supposed to support your team or to back up your team that it's all green, that it's the best in the world. And then there are cultures, and we're closer to that in Danaher, where you like to show a lot of red, because as one of our Japanese senseis reminded us, if you don't have a problem, you have a real problem, which is exactly what you're saying. So this initial way of being open about the problems is quite a challenge in some cultures. And then I think to your point about recognizing things early, for me, it's very important to understand whether we have an individual problem. There's an individual behavior you can look at and you can fix, or a systematic problem. And I think this switch, or that learning to see the difference between an individual and a systemic problem, is key, Because if you, again, to your point, what you said, if you ignore a systematic problem because either you think it's not important or because you think it's an individual problem, it's going to haunt you for the rest of your days. I remember one area, when I led a business unit, I had half of my team in Germany and the other half of my team in the US. So here's what happened in product launches. You had a good product manager in Europe. So the European sales were great. The US sales were very bad. Then you had a product launch led by a product manager in the US, right? The US was great. The European sales were pretty bad. So that's the moment when you realize this is not an individual product manager problem. No matter how good or how brilliant the person is, you need to tackle that in a systemic way. And we did. But I think that sort of learning is important, this way of seeing it. And to your point, sometimes it's easier as a consultant to come in and think, oh my God, because people in that culture obviously don't see it that openly or don't see the contrast to other cultures because they only see their own culture. And for them, their own culture is pretty normal. Whereas for you as a consultant, if you come in, you go like, bloody hell. And this sound which you reference, right?
Yeah, there is a saying that, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And that
Indeed.
means that, so sometimes it's really good to get an outside perspective. And sometimes, when you get an outside perspective, you have it's difficult to relate to that because, we're looking at, so it was a big cycling day yesterday. I don't know if you watched it, but certainly the Danes did yesterday. It was a big day in the Tour de France, and the office is already pretty deserted because there's a big etape today also, and we can be you and I or even a Czech and a Dane could be sitting and looking at the same things going on, and we would have vastly different experiences, and we can agree on everything objectively, again on the surface, but taking it, one step below and thinking about, what does it mean? What does it mean to me? What sort of filters am I applying to this? What is good? What is bad? What are my preferences? What are my expectations? What are my hopes, dreams, and desires? These are very rare, uh, elements of context that comes up in a business conversation. We're good at talking about, okay, so so Vingegaard yesterday was what, a minute 37 or some crazy number faster than that, and then other people will say, yeah, but he looked tired, or he seemed, or I even saw somebody, and they were not German, but they were actually comparing, a clean versus a dirty rider, and Ulrich was actually the one that had the biggest gain over time, and so people came up with all these stories, and so we went from a very like objective conversation, like you would have like at a value stream map, versus standing in the factory floor, looking around and seeing how are people doing, how do they look, how do they walk, how do they solve their tasks? Um, are they engaged? Are they positive to see and solve the problems that they have? So I think we should try to have both. That's why the numbers alone, like we say, they tell a story. Yeah, and they can probably tell any story, depending on what you relate it to. But the more that we can go in and actually understand the individual perspective, we will learn and gain so much more. And obviously, if you have an organization of 10,000 people, it's going to be a very long talk. So maybe we need to do it in a simpler way. But we know today that most of the change management tools that people are using, they refer to Kata and other things. That stuff from back in the 60s and 70s, where most of what we had to change was like production lines, equipment, organizations. So we were talking to people about organizations. Today, we want to discuss with people about their individual experiences. And that requires a very different set. So a lot of people, I'm not going to use the word get hurt, but they sort of hit themselves a little bit on the numbers because they say, yeah, but that's not me. I want to do good. I want to do something different. So I think the conversation around how we use the different tools has to change, because people today are using and are, should we say, affected by the numbers in a very different way. I love going to a site where I visited a factory in Sweden last year, and they had their first VSM, and then they had the one 2 years later, and then the one today. And you're like, huge change, right? And the people were so proud, and they could remember everything that they had done. And we were going from the numbers to individual experiences and shared experiences, shared learnings. So valuable, right? So that conversation is really changing. I want to ask you, if you were to give your younger, of course still young Olaf, I know, but your younger Olaf, a piece of advice when you were sitting in the position that you were describing some 20 years ago, if you could somehow magically go back to time and knock on younger Olaf's door and say, hey, maybe you need to think about, what would you say to him then?
Yeah, I think there's probably two pieces of advice I would give. Number one is to get somebody who can help, call it a coach, call it a mentor, call it a trusted colleague, because when you're in a situation like that, you have worries for the next 100 years, and most of that never occurs. And I think a coach could help to sort out, okay, what are the real worries? What are the 3 things you should really worry about, and then forget about the rest. And that'll take a lot of pressure out, because pressure is what I see a lot when we have these transitions into the first major people management job, right? It's a lot of pressure. So that's number one. And then number two, I think Greg McKeown, the guy who wrote Essentialism, is very good in saying that, hey, there's a curve of effectiveness which probably stops at 85%. So if you invest more than 85%, your effectiveness is actually going down. And I think I mentioned focus in my little story, but I should have been much more ruthless on that, to say, okay, well, this is enough, and we're not going to worry about number 15, 16, and 17. It's not going to make a difference anyway. So you mentioned that a lot of the lean tools are 1960s. Yes, they are. Most of them are still very good, right? So I think this idea of good enough is something I've learned over the years, which I wish I would have learned earlier, because there would have been a lot less, as we say in German, blood, sweat, and tears.
Thank you, Olaf, for sharing your reflections, and thank you for taking the opportunity to go back in time and then reflect back on a situation that has taken place. And I think that's what makes this podcast, a little bit special, is that the transformation has already taken place, right? So here we are talking about something that was in the past. But as you say, sometimes it's good to go back and revisit some of those points in our past and see how they have affected us in our lives today. Most of us are, whether we like it or not, a product of our past and our shared experiences. Who was it that said that, it's never too late to have a good childhood, right? We can still take some of the good things away that happened, and we can be conscious about the way that we act, certainly the way that we act towards other people. And I think, every day through our training, throughout our careers, throughout our lives, we have an opportunity to go into a series of rooms and hopefully create a positive impact with the people that we surround us with. And I think if we really make that a conscious decision to do good and to help others to do good or to do even better, then I think we have a noble cause in our lives, right? And the way that I hear that you are applying yourself now, especially in your new role, to train and develop the organization, still have a focus on, as you said last time, building the business, building the organization, developing people is a noble cause. So I want to thank you for your time and for sharing your story. And thank you for talking today, Olaf.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye now.